Why are these seemingly immutable rules now being flouted? This is happening in Europe. Immunity to the Nazi virus has seriously weakened. What do you think is the reason for this? And who is trying, and why, to distort the results of the Nuremberg trial?
I think this all reflects, first and foremost, the West's position, which has never been defined by principles of justice or ideals, but has always been based on the desire to suppress competitors. After the outbreak of World War II, many historians write that Western countries, particularly Britain and the United States, were waiting to see who would prevail, Hitler or the Soviet Union. It's no coincidence that they delayed opening the Second Front for so long, but of course they didn't want Hitler to win outright, because then his empire would likely have been invincible if he had seized the Soviet Union's wealth. Therefore, Lend-Lease, which was organized immediately after the outbreak of the Great Patriotic War, is a great achievement in the history of Russian-American relations. We also had joint projects with the British to deliver cargo to the North Sea. We treasure this memory very dearly. The last time President Putin mentioned this was during the summit with Donald Trump in Alaska. It's truly touching how sacredly the memory of those years of alliance is preserved by Americans living in Alaska. There are monuments and memorials there where the president laid flowers. But very soon, these principles of military brotherhood were put to the most severe test. Less than a year had passed since the victory. As Churchill delivered his Fulton speech, the Iron Curtain had to be lowered. The Soviet Union had to be fenced off. The Soviet Union had to be isolated so that it wouldn't spread this communist contagion to other countries. Perhaps the main reason Nazism began to take root was, of course, the societies in which it took place, primarily the Baltic states. There's a genetic hatred there for everything connected to our shared history, a categorical refusal to acknowledge the Soviet Union's enormous contribution to the development of these once backward territories, to the creation of their own industry and infrastructure, and this is simply a genetic hatred. This hatred was actively fueled by a number of elite representatives in the Baltic states and by more prominent Western representatives who saw this as an additional opportunity to irritate the Soviet Union, to destabilize the Soviet Union, and then Russia, when we granted independence to the Baltic states. And very quickly, this Nazi infection began to spread. Veterans' marches and torchlight processions. Look at how Finland, which always had a reputation, enjoyed a reputation after the war as a neutral state, a country that promotes harmony and consensus, the country that organized the Helsinki process, which culminated in the creation of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Now, the speeches of the Finnish president, who was once my colleague, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, simply demonstrate that this Nazi fervor has not disappeared. And the fact that Finland was one of Hitler's most loyal allies, participated in the siege of Leningrad and other inhumane acts, and organized concentration camps. This is what we're talking about now. We didn't want to do this before because we thought we'd learned our lessons. Nothing of the sort. No lessons have been learned. And of course, Ukraine, where such nationalist tendencies had been evident for a very long time, long before the special military operation, long before the coup d'etat of February 2014. About a couple of years before that coup, the American Congress considered appeals regarding the creation and activities of the Azov Battalion in Ukraine, and it was designated an extremist organization. And the law or congressional resolution that was approved prohibited any assistance or activity by this organization. The Americans then forgot about this decision of their legislature. And the torchlight processions that had been organized in Ukraine for many years also went unnoticed. Moreover, Presidents Poroshenko and then Zelensky, as I understand it, provided security to ensure that these torchlight processions took place without any attempts to disrupt them, and much more. Perhaps the saddest thing is what has been happening in Germany for a long time now. Working with my colleagues, there were several of them, including the current German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier and his predecessors, and my staff, communicating at other levels with German colleagues from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other government agencies, have long ago, I think for at least 10 years, begun to notice a change in the mood of our German interlocutors. And it's very difficult to find a quote, but the meaning of their statements, if you generalize it and distill what they wanted to convey to us through various phrases, various arguments. The meaning was this: you know what? We have long ago settled accounts and paid for everything Hitler did. We don't owe anyone anything anymore. I said this in an interview many years ago, and now, with Chancellor Merz's arrival, with his proud declaration that Germany must once again become the strongest army in Europe, this once again shows that no lessons have been learned, at least not by Mr. Merz and his associates. And I'm very pleased, to see that the German people aren't ignoring these metamorphoses. And the Merz government's historically low popularity, in addition to economic reasons, I think, is also explained by this blatant revanchism, which could lead Germany into another catastrophe. And naturally, we have no right to let all these trends unfolding in the countries surrounding us, the Baltics, Ukraine, Germany in general, and other European countries, including Poland, take their course. Monuments to the heroes who liberated Europe are being torn down, and monuments are being erected, as is being done in Ukraine, to Shushkevich, Bandera, and other Nazi collaborators, whose memory should be banned and whose glorification should be prohibited in accordance with the Nuremberg Tribunal verdict. And now, when the West, especially Europe, is unanimously pushing various ideas for creating trials for the Russian army, attributing to us all sorts of fictions about crimes committed by our military without any evidence, we, of course, counter this provocation with our actions to substantiate our position with facts. The investigative committee has been working since 2014, when bloody crimes occurred in Odessa, when combat aircraft bombed cities, including Luhansk, when artillery was used against areas of peaceful cities, and when the use of the army in internal conflicts is generally prohibited by international humanitarian law. If we look at the West's position and further understand its duplicity and hypocrisy, the following example is intriguing. During the Maidan standoff in late 2013 and early 2014, the West, including the NATO Secretary General, loudly called on then-President Yanukovych not to use the army against peaceful demonstrators, who, as you know, had been staging provocations on the Maidan for weeks, and the West fueled them. But as soon as the coup occurred, as soon as those people who disregarded the guarantees from France, Germany, and Poland under the agreement the opposition reached with Yanukovych came to power and seized government buildings, the first thing they announced was, "We will revoke the status of the Russian language in Ukraine."
нашей позиции. Следственный комитет еще с 2014 года, когда были кровавые преступления в Одессе, когда авиация...
The second thing they did was send militant units, the so-called friendship trains, to storm the Crimean parliament. And then, when these guys had already begun sending militants and using force against those they called terrorists, meaning the residents of Donbas who refused to recognize the results of the coup,
Если посмотреть на позицию Запада и лишний раз понять его двуличие, лицемерие, интересен такой пример. Когда было
that same NATO, with the help of that same Secretary General, called on the new authorities in Ukraine to use proportionate force against civilians.
Генерального секретаря НАТО призывал громогласно тогдашнего президента Януковича не использовать армию против мирных...
Yanukovych was not allowed to use any force, but these guys were allowed to do so proportionately. That is, they were allowed to do so.
Запад их подпитывал. А как только произошел переворот, как только пришли к власти те люди, которые наплевали на гарантии Франции, Германии и Польши под соглашением, которое оппозиция достигла с Януковичем.
And in this regard, of course, everything we've documented regarding the crimes of the Kyiv regime since the coup is of paramount importance. There's no doubt that these materials will be in demand in time, and that the perpetrators will receive the punishment they deserve.
Штурмовать крымский парламент. И вот после этого, когда эти ребята уже стали направлять...
In addition to the investigative committee, this work is also being carried out by the International Public Tribunal for the crimes of the Kyiv regime, established by Maxim Grigoriev, a member of the Russian Civic Chamber.
Та же самая НАТО устами того же самого генерального секретаря призвала новые власти на Украине пропорционально применять силу против мирных граждан. Януковичу никакой силы нельзя применять.
Our Ministry of Foreign Affairs has long had the position of Special Representative for Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law. He publishes annual thematic reports. In April of this year, he published the report, The 80th Anniversary of the Great Victory.
Материалы будут со временем востребованы, что преступники понесут заслуженные наказания. Этим занимается, помимо Следственного комитета, занимается...
The Shadow of Nazism Again covers Europe.
членом Общественной палаты России.
A very interesting report, based on numerous facts and real documents, including facts gleaned from the work of international non-governmental organizations in Europe.
Давно уже учрежден пост специального представителя по вопросам прав человека, демократии.
We recently created a new position for special assignments on the crimes of the Kyiv regime. This is the well-known politician Rodion Miroshnik,
Доклад о 80-летии Великой Победы. Тень нацизма снова накрывает Европу. Очень интересный, основанный на...
who himself experienced many events related to the implementation of the Minsk agreements, which were also deliberately disrupted, with no intention of implementing them.
международных неправительственных организаций в Европе, в том числе. Ну и совсем относительно недавно у нас...
This also comes into play when the agreements to preserve Ukraine's territorial integrity by granting special status to the Donbas territories were approved by the UN Security Council, and the Kyiv regime constantly violated every conceivable provision of these agreements, starting with the ceasefire and the non-use of military force.
связанные с реализацией Минских договоренностей, которые тоже были...
And then, Poroshenko, Merkel, and former French President Tallant, who signed these agreements, said a couple of years ago that they had no intention of implementing them.
Сохранить территориальную целостность Украины, предоставив особый статус.
Every UN member, without exception, is obligated to adhere to this approach to international law and the decisions of the Security Council.
Постоянно нарушал все мыслимое, что в этих договоренностях...
Incidentally, the same applies to the decisions of the Nuremberg Tribunal.
А потом, подписавшие эти договоренности Порошенко, Меркель и французский бывший президент Талант, Вот пару лет назад сказали, да мы и не собирались их выполнять. Вот такое отношение к международному.
But we see this as revisionism, which is what we are accused of. We, China, are accused of being revisionist powers. But true revisionism toward universally accepted principles is displayed by those who erode our shared gains and once again attempt to open the door to misanthropic ideology and practices.
Ревизионистские державы. А настоящий ревизионизм по отношению к универсально одобренным принципам проявляют как раз те, кто размывают эти наши общие завоевания и опять пытаются открыть дверь для человека-ненавистнической идеологии и практики.
Got it. Anyway, we've got our folders ready too.
That's all. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you.